you so much for being here. We're thrilled that you could make it to this special event where we get to hear Professor Kim Cornish in conversation with Professor Viv Ellis to learn more about the post-pandemic child. As we get started, we'd like to both welcome you here and acknowledge the country on which we gather. So my name's Russ Fox. I'm going to MC tonight's event. And I'm a son, a husband, I'm a brother, and I'm a father. And I just want to share some connection to people. I have 3 sons, and we live and play on Wurundjeri land by the banks of the Birrarung River in Warrandyte. And we have benefited our generations of English, Irish, and Welsh convicts who've travelled to Australia and free settlers. We've benefited greatly over generations and generations from the lands that were dispossessed from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. And as part of our acknowledgement of country, we acknowledge that the impact of this dispossession is ongoing, and the dislocation and disconnection from lands and waters and sky is having ongoing effects. And as we gather here in person on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and wherever you may be gathering online, we pay our respects to elders through time, given that time is not a linear conceptualization like it is in Western cultures. And so in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we engage in conversation here in that spirit, openly and honestly, as we understand more deeply the implications of the pandemic on people. So we pay our respects to elders through time, and we welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us tonight in person or online. It is a real pleasure to introduce both Professor Viv Ellis and Professor Kim Cornish. And we have the pleasure of discussing the post-pandemic child. Professor Viv Ellis is the Dean of the Faculty of Education here at Monash University. It's an incredibly prestigious faculty, and he's a fabulous leader of it. His focus in research is on teacher education and making university institutions the best they can be to prepare teachers to do the important work they do. And we look forward to hearing more about his experiences and expertise as he asks interesting and opening questions of Professor Kim Cornish. So Professor Kim Cornish is the founding director of the Turner Institute of Brain and Mental Health and is the Sir John Monash Distinguished Scholar here at Monash University. She has been head of the School of Psychological Sciences and has written recently this book, which is the focus of our conversation. And we can talk about the over 130 published articles that Professor Cornish has written. And we can talk about the millions of dollars in competitive grant funding and philanthropic funding that has gone to the Turner Institute. But tonight, the focus of our conversation is on her work on child development and understanding the impact of the pandemic on young people, particularly here in Australia. And so, ladies and gentlemen, if you would, welcome Professor Viv Ellis and Professor Kim Cornish.
Thank you, Russ. And thank you, Kim, for accepting the invitation to the Faculty of Education here at Monash. Your book is in the Monash University Press in the National Interest series. So there are 41 titles now in that series, and they're meant to stimulate debate on topics of national interest. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to write the book?
Yes, the book was written out of, for me as a child, developmental researcher, and that has been my area of research for the last 30 years. It came out of a pandemic that had clearly recognised the importance of developing mental health for teenagers and young people. And over the pandemic, I saw millions of dollars put into these programs, and still $1 million are still needed, but they were a priority. What I didn't see as a priority was primary school children. So children who would have entered school for the first time, which over the country equated to over 700,000 children who should have entered grade 1 prep and grade 2 and didn't during 2020 and 2021. And I wondered when I was asked to write this book what that looks like now. So when I wrote it last year, it was 3 years. Excuse me, but where are those children now? 3 years later, they're 9 years old, 8 years old, and now, a year after that, they're 9 and they're 10. And it was concerning to me that they were becoming almost a forgotten population, that their children, they'll catch up. My argument in the book is that let's look at the evidence, and I would state categorically they are not catching up.
Okay. I mean, it's very interesting at the beginning of the book, and for people here who haven't read the book, I do thoroughly recommend it because it does exactly what I think the series is intended to do. But one of the things you do at the beginning, which is really interesting, is you sketch a situation pre-pandemic. So you talk about what it was like for children and young people and their families.
Yes.
And you talk particularly about the differential access to technology, about the needs of children living in poverty, children from Indigenous families. You talk about too much screen time. You talk about lack of access to the same resources in different education systems. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and elaborate on it, because it struck me as it's really important for the rest of the book.
Yeah. When I look at 2019 and we looked at, all of us in this room here will remember what 2019 December was like. We were moving into a brand new decade. Nobody had heard of COVID. We'd begun to have the fires that had started, but there was a sense of normality as we knew it then. And one of the great characteristics about Australia, which may differentiate from many other countries, is that children have free education. They have access to free medical care. And we talk about that a lot, as though that is equitable wherever your child lives, wherever they are, whatever your circumstances. And what was clear is that even in the pre-pandemic age, we had enormous differences in wealth, enormous differences in access to schools and access to psychiatric or mental health resources and education. And it did matter. It mattered whether your child had a disability. It mattered whether your child came from poverty. And I think when the pandemic hit, it was just assumed, for example, that everybody would have access, the basic thing, would have access to internet, would be able to carry on learning. But even before the pandemic, there was wide discrepancies all over Australia.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me was the focus on too much screen time.
Yeah,
Can you say a bit more about that? Because that's something that's been of interest to psychologists and neuroscientists for quite a while.
So we talk a lot about the pandemic increasing exponentially our screen time with our kids, right? And it clearly is an epidemic now. But it wasn't far off before. There'd already been government reports and foundations that were really concerned that even babies and toddlers were being exposed to too much screen time. There was recommendations even before the pandemic about making sure that health workers and GPs had material to give to expectant mums so they knew about the dangers of screen time. So research had already begun to show this detrimental, how detrimental it could be to the human brain development if screening continued the way it was. And in particular, there had been research that had suggested pre-pandemic that it was impacting children's mental health. It was impacting their learning, it was impacting their sleep, and creating a bubble of affect that would really impair learning as they went through their school years from primary through to high school. And so there was already a concern at that point.
It was interesting because one of the members of our faculty, Kellyanne Allen, and her team in the School of Educational Psychology and Counselling have analysed some of the PISA data and done a secondary analysis. And they found that there's been a declining trend around that sense of how children belong to school since 2003. It accelerated over the period of the pandemic, but the sense to which it might recover is really uncertain if that's a kind of pre-existing trend. That's about school. I mean, the situation pre-pandemic, what would you say about the capability of school or the capacity of schools to engage these children who later in the book you go on to talk about they've been most affected?
Yeah, I think for many children with different neurodivergent needs, for many children that were living in poverty, that were living with family violence, and people that were living in remote, regional and very remote Australia, had, at least from my perspective and from the research, they had school at the very core of what they did, at least in the primary school years. I'm well aware that high school students, school is not and may not be their primary source, but it is certainly the stable in schools for primary school across this country. And for many children, I can give you an example now of children who were very heavily involved in child protection. Yeah. So these were children whose only part of their day was protected by going to schools. So you had that protection, you know, they could be with the children, they could protect that child, and that was their centre for being there. The pandemic took that away. The pandemic took away, you know, children's access to schools in very remote and rural areas and regional areas. It took away the ability of children to learn if you came from such poverty that you were not able to have access to laptops and digital resources, which is what was almost a national assumption that everybody had access to this learning, and they did not. And so for me, the children who started the pandemic as the most vulnerable, those in really disadvantaged communities, fared the least compared to children who came from an affluent background, or even from your typical average school that, you know, your parents had a couple of laptops, your parents could help. Those families that started disadvantaged are now even more disadvantaged, and nobody really talks about that.
Yeah. I think you sketched that really powerfully at the beginning of the book. But then, of course, it's the pandemic. And the thing that struck me as I was reading the book was how much I'd forgotten, or deliberately forgotten.
It was like post-traumatic stress going through it all again. Yeah.
I mean, the startling things in it, I mean, if we think about our own experience of work, if we think about our own experience of living as adults, and then put ourselves in the places of very young children, particularly the group you're talking about, that are about to enter school and expect to enter school, and the families expect them to enter school. If you put it in the psychological language that you're using, what were those impacts? What happened?
The impacts were absolutely catastrophic, right? And we will see that now as our 8 and 9-year-olds go into the early teenage years. The first 2 years of their school life was completely disrupted. We had the stable building fundamental blocks of learning and social communication were wiped away. Right, and all of us can say, well, you know, these are young kids, they'll all catch up. They haven't all caught up. We are, you know, they had that ability to learn how to play with friends, make and lose friendships, the ability to listen to an adult outside of their home and take instruction from that adult, the ability to socially connect with others around them, and the basic things for those of you who have children here, the ability to take turns, to be able to sit down in a classroom. You know, the gateway to learning is attention and focus, and that develops within the context of a classroom over those 2 fundamental years. And so we have social emotional lapses, we have the fundamentals of cognition and learning because attention is so impaired. Screen time in learning didn't really help that. It over-aroused children rather than kept them calm. And so these fundamental building blocks were absent. And so for me, that's why when COVID, when the lockdowns ended, and children were allowed to go back to school, it was a trickle. It wasn't a rush with children going back, let's see all my friends. That wasn't there at all. And also, you know, this enormous divide between families that had managed to get through COVID and their children were ready to go back, and those families that are still not ready to go back became so evident.
There's a very powerful image in the book of, which I remember from my walks through my 5K radius, you know, of playgrounds with roundabouts and slides taped off.
Yes.
A very
That
kind of symbolic
and
thing.
it was so symbolic. And you know what it did? Is that it made children who prior to that time had seen playgrounds as their safe space.
Yeah.
They had seen it as a place where they can meet with their mates, they can, you know, handle the world, they can go up onto swings, they can go onto high slides and play, and all those boundaries that were part of their normal lives were just drifted apart. When this happened, you know, we saw children who would walk past this in a playground, and all of a sudden that was not a safe place. That was dangerous, and we will never really know for our 4 and 5 year olds at that time, or even older than that, how they process that. Because that safe place that all their lives had been there for most children had gone. And danger and insecurity and fear replaced that.
You mentioned then, and it's really interesting in the book too, that you talk about some families could have grown stronger during this period because they create, and I like the phrase, they created new traditions. You know, there were new conditions, so they created new kind of social practices around that, and they got used to it, and they enriched their children's lives.
And they flourished from it.
And there is some evidence in sort of reviews of the evidence of children faring through the pandemic that some children seem to have bounced back, but you're identifying a group that hasn't.
Yeah, I'm identifying, I think, what I would now call a majority minority who have not bounced back, who are struggling with connectedness and loneliness, who are struggling with being so addicted to their screens, it's almost their comfort blanket, and being unable to follow the normal instructions in class because they're either fearful, they have lost cognitive capacity in that time, they are so inattentive. There was a recent report and a lot of media attention over the rise of ADHD in our classrooms. To me, that is because a couple of things. One, teachers are so brilliant at being able to recognise risk behaviours or poor attention in children, even within the first month. My whole career has been based on that with teachers, and they are brilliant at doing that in a classroom, not online. And also, screen time simply creates more distraction, it over-arouses, and it doesn't have that effect, calm, that is there in a classroom. And one of the dangers of that now is that rise in ADHD symptoms in our primary school children, if left untreated, if left unrecognised, under-resourced, will actually result in primary ADHD and the whole insidious impact that has along the teenage years.
Can you talk a bit more about, because we all knew about online learning and, you know, trying to replace education through schools with Zoom and virtual kind of learning. That doesn't come out so strongly in your book, I think, for very good reasons. Can you say a bit about that? I mean, it was to an extent the best people could do, but again, the way that opportunity was mediated within homes and families differed enormously.
Because it is like a melting pot, isn't it? You have the whole of the nation across its many different ways of working. You've got young mums and dads who, you know, still had to work in order to bring in a salary, you had mums and dads and family members who didn't even know how to use a laptop in that way. You had the brilliant job of teachers that were the backbone, in my view, that actually transformed learning, had to overnight. But it was dependent also on the families to actually partner with them on that. And you had families that did that really well. We had it in our surveys, we had people that said, my children was really happy, they were good independent learners. So for them, that family dynamic was very different to getting your child to go into a classroom online when they were scrolling all night, or they were so tired, or they were so disinterested, or they were lack of focus. So, it was a whole melting pot that went into there. And I don't think that, at least at the moment, I can't see any research that has really looked at the impact of that now.
Thank you.
So just to say as well, though, Viv, is that teachers didn't start from an equal platform. Again, if you had means for private education, you were maybe advantaged more than if you were from, your local state school, where they were struggling to even come to grips with that for a while, and you were struggling to understand what they wanted as a parent. Well, you're busy trying to juggle your finances, you're busy trying to juggle other parts of your life to make the pandemic work.
Yeah. And you bring that, the differential access to technology, you bring out very strongly at the beginning of the book. Another really strong image in the book for me around the pandemic was public housing block in central Melbourne, going through one of the really hard lockdowns, surrounded by 500 police, and the residents and their families and children not being able to exit, and actually not always getting access to food during that period. Obviously, the situation differed across Australia, and Victoria had one particular kind of experience. But those lockdowns were part of public policy. And although you don't talk about it explicitly in the book, I got a sense you were making a relationship between decisions made around lockdowns, duration of lockdowns, extent of lockdowns, and the impact that that has had on the children that we're talking about.
It's a good question, Viv, but it's really hard not to do that when you went through the Melbourne lockdown, to actually look at what that was like for your neighbours, for your own family, for your friends in the community around you. For me, I try to focus not so much on whether that was the right policy decision. It definitely was the right policy decision at the time it was made for the people who made it, for sure. But, you're looking at families who, the hardest thing was the snap lockdowns. From the rest of my life, I will remember those. I can remember being in the city at 6 o'clock and being told everything's shutting down in 2 hours. And you can see that children would have been with friends, and then they weren't with friends. And then this massive uncertainty that those created for families. And I talk in the book about, how not being able to go to your friend's house, not going to be able to see your grandparents, not going to your own birthday. You can't have your own birthday party because you could 5 hours earlier, but you now can't. And this massive uncertainty was, to me, like a tidal wave on children's, as part and parcel of children's psychological distress. And, there is a wealth of research that we need in this nation now about how our children process that. I'm assuming that there is great research has been funded, and that hopefully those results will come in soon. But it created a tidal wave. And again, I would say it was based on means, on wealth, on access to private healthcare, access to different opportunities that were not there for every child.
Do you notice in the evidence different outcomes for children in different territories and states? Because the experiences across Australia were very different, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. Sydney maybe a little bit more like us by the end. Research will tell in the next 2 years as to how children have fared from a very big school lockdown like Melbourne to, for example, Western Australia. But even Western Australia, I would argue, did not go unscathed because it could not see relatives. They could not bring anybody in to that state for nearly 2 years. So while it lived in a little cocoon, it also lived without family members and being able to visit other states and,
So just to push on that a little bit more, there will be another pandemic. Sorry to bring a downer, but that's the cycle, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, whenever. What advice would you give to future Australian governments around public policy and pandemics to kind of mitigate against the effects that you've noticed?
I would say, actually, speaking as a researcher in child development, that the best way we're going to be able to cope with another pandemic in, say, even 30 years, when our children are 39, that we should be investing now in their mental health, their learning, and their opportunities for every single child wherever they live. We need to build a resilient generation of children that will cope with uncertainty because they would have had the skill set to do that. We would have looked after them as a nation from now right until they go into the workplace, because we will have a solid, productive workplace if we do that. If we don't, then we will have 38 and 39-year-olds who are suffering from major psychiatric illnesses, from low productivity, from low self-confidence, from not being able to cope with change. So I would say start now with our children, right now, not when we see another pandemic around the corner. Because, sorry, those 39-year-olds will be parents themselves at that point.
And it goes right the way through the book in terms of the outcomes are related to the pre-existing kind of situation pre-pandemic. In the last part of the book, you bring an agenda into play, and you have a kind of call for action, and you've started to explain that, and it's quite detailed in parts because it involves you sort of hypothesizing around new kinds of workers that work with young people, that work in schools, that work in mental health. So could you start to elaborate? You did just then, but we start now and then we build for the future, and we're doing things that prepare this generation, but also future generations.
So all of this is very much based in the science of what happens in pre-pandemic when children go through primary school and their early symptoms of different neurodiversity are not recognised. Right, so we know that if children are really inattentive in class, really disruptive, really impulsive, if that is not recognised, if that is not intervened and with early interventions, the likelihood is that child may go on to have a full ADHD diagnosis. We know that children who suffer from worry in school pre-pandemic, and it's hard to believe, what do children of 4 and 5 worry about, right? Pre-pandemic. But now we have got children who, if we do not recognise worry going into general anxiety by the age of 10, will also have adult generalised anxiety that will be debilitating in the teenage years. So we know from evidence prior to the pandemic that risk behaviours in early childhood can have a deleterious impact on learning, on academic outcome, on how they live productively post-secondary, they get through secondary. So we had all of that. So what we now have is, in my opinion, a shift earlier. So we would have that happen maybe late childhood pre-pandemic, but it is now happening to some of our children at the age of 7 and 8. So we need to act quickly. And we know, I mean, this is not blind science. We know that early interventions are absolutely critical in the early days if we are going to prevent this deleterious impact that I talked about. So my scenario is, if the government and the communities around them could actually work with enormous resources that would really help teachers, that would help families and the adults that work around children, and in particularly in disadvantaged communities. If we could work around that with the school at the centre, then we could really help transform mental health resources that could be given to children, mental health resources that could be given to families and parents, to the workers around them, and to teachers. And so one of the proposals that we talk about is, and I recognise, and all of you here in the education faculty will recognise, that we can't add more burden to teachers. You know, it's easy talk to say, well, let's give them resources and they can go and do it with their kids. They are already at maximum capacity. But we thought, well, one solution is to transform a workforce. What if, instead of depending on government support to make ever more clinical psychology places, more education and developmental psychology places, which will never happen. There will never be enough. That bottleneck will always be there. What if we use our graduates in psychology that are trained in an accredited psychology and build a pathway in there so they could become psychology assistants that would then be able to go into schools, work in the early part of the prevention and interventions with teachers and with families to ease this enormous burden. So that was one solution that we have given to government. And what that also means is that we have in the psychology discipline 15,000 graduates a year approximately, of which 7% will only ever go into graduate clinical training because of the constraints. We then have, over 10,000 more every year coming out with degrees that with an additional fourth year training will actually enable them to make a huge impact in schools.
Yeah. And that was shocking to me at the end in terms of the numbers there. So we have psychology assistants or graduate assistants working in schools, working with families. What do they do for non-psychologists amongst us? What kind of activities are those involved?
They would very much look at how they can instrument early mental health prevention in classrooms. They can train teachers. They'll be able to work with parents on how you can talk to your child about early mental health. They'll be able to work with teachers about looking at how a child who's really distracted and unfocused can, if we take away the problem and unfold it bit by bit, what does that mean? What a teacher can help do with that child. They will be able to really facilitate that promotion, early intervention, very basic interventions that teachers just have no capacity to do. It will take that away and instead replace that more positive outcome in a classroom.
You mentioned it in one of your answers just now, and it does come through strongly in the book, schools being so important as a hub not just for children, but for the families and for communities.
Yeah.
And the notion has been sort of quite long-standing about multi-professional working around young children and families. Can you see, and I think you do start to elaborate it at the end, other kinds of new workers, people who work with children? They might not be trained psychologists, but and they might not be doing sort of brief psychological interventions or working alongside teachers. Can you see opportunities for other kinds of professionals to work with children?
I can, because this is very much a community approach. You want communities now to flourish. So what helps a community flourish in whatever part of Australia they're currently living in, they're currently building? You need your community groups to flourish. You need to pour funding into community groups that allow, for example, children to move away from their screens in order to do some organised community sports. You need community leaders as part of that. We have already engaged with social workers. You've got allied health professionals. But this new workforce proposal is something that would be specifically for schools. And I think having as many professionals around you as possible is wonderful. But for me, training a new generation to really fill that gap in the public sector is critical.
One of the aims you state for these new kinds of professionals to work with children and families is to produce, quote, a resistant, not a resistant, that might have been a Freudian slip then, a resilient generation.
Yeah.
So how do you produce a resilient generation, especially post-pandemic?
Yeah, I think you produce it as a community. So you use your community around you. The teachers play that pivotal role in the learning component of it, and often now the social emotional component of it. But working with your community leaders, working with the adults that are in that child's life is going to be critical. School is a constant, so for me, I'm really passionate about, in primary school children, the school wherever they live is a constant. It might be the only place they can access a computer to learn. It might be the only place they can have friends and they can have somewhat of a daily routine that is away from violence, away from poverty and so on. But for me, the schools cannot just do that themselves. They are a learning hub to create our great children to go into, to become great citizens later, and productive and well citizens. But to me, the approach that I love the most is that community agenda, working with community leaders, working so we've got resources that are culturally adaptive, so we can recognise the strengths and weaknesses of different communities compared to others, and work with them. So it's easy to say, let the government put a big pot of money together, and yes, they should, but we also need that community as well.
Does it involve teaching people to be resilient? Can you teach people to be resilient? Or is the community involvement more around activity, relationships, interaction?
I think it's both. I think, social connectedness is lost in so many children at the moment. Community brings that together. Teaching resilience to children, emotion regulation, is very much, I think, already part of some of the curriculum we have. But teaching teachers to have that emotional regulation as well. There's a really successful program at McGill University in Canada in the Faculty of Education there, which has worked for years in building programs for pre-service teachers. So those that are in training to go out and build resilience in themselves, so that they and emotional regulation, we can call it whatever. We can call it resilience, we can call it emotional regulations, we can call it grit. It is something that is that can be developed, and is developed, maybe in more places than I'm aware of, but it's something that has worked in many different countries.
The importance of the school comes out all the time in your answers and in the book, but what we also know is that there's now a problem in many parts of the world, including in Australia, with what some people call school refusal or school can't, people who just can't go to school. Do you see that as a problem that's been exacerbated by the pandemic?
I think it's a problem that really needs to be tackled well. And it needs to be tackled on the ground in schools. It needs to be tackled with health professionals, with psychologists. We have a situation where there have been so many absences in primary school children, way more than there have ever been in this country. And I know some of it is coming back, but some of it isn't. Last year there was a Senate inquiry about, how do we tackle school refusal? How do we work with children that are not going to school because they just don't want to go and don't want to learn and don't want to put out going because they really psychologically get distressed to go, which is something that is rare for primary school children, which we've seen a massive upsurge. So the core recommendation from that Senate inquiry is to begin to look at how can teachers know when a child is refusing to go to school? And at the moment it doesn't say school refusal on anything. It says, is your child absent sickness or not? And it needs to be tackled with parents as well, because for many parents, when we speak to them through surveys and in focus groups, it's been that they just do not want to admit their child won't go to school. So they stay at home with them on their work days from home. We need to look at the root causes and look at what are the factors that determine a young girl, for example, who's 9 years old, not wanting to go to school, has no friends, gets distressed to even get out of bed in the morning. How can we tackle that? And it's a really hard one for the education system to do, because there's no easy answer. There's no real hybrid we could use. And children, what I'm fearing is that children end up losing months and months of these critical cognitive and social emotional developmental periods because they are too afraid to come to school, and we need to tackle why they're afraid. And this is why, for me, building digital or building resources that will help teachers and parents recognise early signs of distress and be able to talk to their child about it.
Okay, so you've got a phone call coming up in your ideal world with the Prime Minister. What do you ask for?
I would ask him to invest now, not to wait until the problem resolves, not to wait until future governments have to deal with the outcome of no or not no investment, but not enough and not in the right way.
Yeah.
I would like to see the Prime Minister's office invest in our children, in mental health resources, invest in schools, invest in families, invest in communities, so that our children can begin the journey of talking about their mental health, how it related to their early childhood, and build a wonderful opportunity to build communities that are, instead of focusing on poor mental health problems that are escalating into serious psychiatric disorders, but instead are saying, how can we work with communities to make your children as resilient as they can be?
So if you were to advise him to do one significant, achievable thing now, what would it be?
Invest in the new psychology workforce, invest in it, get all of the regions, get rural, remote, metropolitan, all of them involved in a new workforce that can transform the mental health landscape for children in this nation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kim. So what we're going to do now is open out the discussion to the audience here in the room and also to questions from our viewers and listeners online. So would anyone like to start with a question for Kim? And Russ will come towards you with the roving microphone. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jen, ex-Monash PhD here. I have the unfortunate of finishing my PhD 10 days before we went to lockdown, the 10th of March 2020. So my question is, so I literally went back as a secondary teacher in 2022 when the kids were, at that stage it was still, we weren't sure whether they can go back to normal, because you know how in 2021 we went for a few weeks and then a few weeks off and a few weeks on. So my question is to you, Kim, would you, or I'm not sure, you probably have done considerable research already, to research on the impact of mental health on certainly the secondary kids, because I literally taught years 7 to 10. So the year 7 were in year 5 in 2020, and the year 9 were in should have been in year 7, and they had 2 years of lockdown.
There is certainly research throughout the pandemic, and the Murdoch Children's Hospital have been fantastic in providing research where they assess predominantly teenagers, in some cases children. So we do have a small body of research, particularly in Victoria, that began to look at ratings from parents about how they saw their children's mental health. So we knew even during the pandemic that it was deteriorating in some children. And part of the reason that I'm so passionate about young children is that they weren't even really included. Like, you know, you have your 5 and your 6-year-old, you know, as though these children were not impacted. And yet nobody really has the tools to measure, either then or maybe they do now, but they did not have the tools to measure this group of children, this cohort of children, as to how they were feeling about the lockdowns and about how their life changed in an instant.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly stimulating. I've got so many questions, but one is the role of the teacher. So, you know, you talk about a graduate psychology workforce and supporting kids, but I wonder, how can teachers, given their own mental health issues often, but how can they embed mental health in their own curricula, pedagogy? How can they make that part of what they do in everyday practice? Along with, you know, we've got all these pressures around teaching, around literacy and numeracy, So
I totally agree, because we've seen almost like a sliding door almost of burnout in the profession very quickly when the schools came back. That was probably lingering all the way through lockdown. I would love to see more availability of teacher-based resources to actually improve recognise the early signs and seek help, you know, for themselves earlier than we have now. And at the moment, I really don't. I mean, there's a ton of apps out there you can look into, but none, as far as I can see, have ever been developed specifically and co-designed with teachers to actually help them recognise signs of burnout, recognise signs of, for example, like, you know, we talked about in adults, there's like cognitive symptoms of poor decision making and inability to focus, along with social and along with psychological early signs of distress. So I think if there's anything that can be done now, it would be wonderful for a well-funded study to focus on co-developing, co-design with teachers how they can protect their own mental health and well-being.
And the second part of that question, the second part, yeah, I agree, and I know you're doing work in that space, yeah. But the second part of the question was, how can teachers embed mental health support for students within their own curricular pedagogy?
They, in the programs that I've seen that are working really well in Canada, there are programs that firstly work with teachers about themselves. So they focus on building a teacher that feels in charge of emotions, in charge of their own mental health. And then they work on how can they then transfer those skills into their classrooms and their environments that they work in. So they are a long way ahead, but we have many lessons that we can learn from the Faculty of Education at McGill and all around Canada that really has this approach of resilience and coping within schools, within teachers as well, as because your classroom isn't going to flourish if you're not flourishing. So starting with the teachers, starting with what can be embedded in them, and then embedded in their students.
Thank you. One of the most famous North American teacher education programs is at the University of Chicago, and it's 2 years, and running alongside the teaching is what they call a soul strand, and it's about the soul of the teacher. You know, it's unabashedly about that. They produce about 27 teachers a year. And in a time of teacher shortages and a time of high accountability, that's a big conversation to have with policymakers who want teachers quickly, they want them effective quickly, and there then tends to be a sense that they burn them out quickly.
It is, it's almost as though the skeleton and the foundation that is really needed to build that, you know, good, strong mental health in teachers is just not there. Like the toolkits aren't there. But with, again, investment, this is all part of the vision, is that investments in this. You create stronger teachers, you're going to have stronger classrooms. Your teachers will stay in those classrooms.
I think, did you have a question?
Thanks, Kim. Obviously, I know you very well, but I have a question for you that may be a little bit controversial, because some of the issues that have been flagged are concerns that were there pre-pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And then we have this pandemic, which accentuates those problems. And I have a sense now we're post-pandemic, and I'm in public health, as you know, that there's quite a lot of the community, including government, where it's hear no evil, see no evil, right? And you know, it's almost, and even families are like the trauma of reliving the issues that were raised and the consequences for their children and themselves is almost like, I don't want to hear about it, I want to heal, I want to move on. How do we then make that investment in pitch that you've pointed out that is so critical without even having to talk about the pandemic and say, you know, it surely was something that made it worse, but we needed this investment before. We needed more teachers. We needed teachers that, you know, all of this stuff happening well before the pandemic, and the pandemic just made it worse. What do we do?
I think we seriously embed funding in schools, and we start with communities that are severely disadvantaged. We start looking at families who had neurodivergent children whose world was shaken up and is still not there. We focus on those communities, and we invest in those communities and the leaders and the services that community can offer, and we invest in the schools so it's seamless. You know, so money is given to now strengthen resilience and social emotional cognition and behaviour in teachers, it seamlessly then goes into classrooms. You know, tools and technologies are developed so they can be delivered to scale to the poorest of families. And it just embeds itself seamlessly into a school life. Because I think, as I've said throughout, to me, the only constant in every child really is their school. And so investing in that at multiple levels, so that when children, you know, children can talk about their feelings, they can talk about what they were afraid of, and it's something that is a natural progression for them.
I'm going to ask 2 questions, if that's okay. The first one is an identification intervention question, and the second one is a neuroaffirming universal question. So I'm what they call ADHD as, this is the technical term, myself personally, and I have 3 wonderfully interesting, neurodivergent, funky, legendary sons. And and it's an interesting experience to go through the diagnostic process, and it's one that costs a lot of money and is difficult and has many appointments, and it's something that not everyone can afford to do, particularly in a timely fashion. Do you have any suggestions around what might be done to make that not something else that bakes in inequality into the system that you discussed earlier?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, that, because, you know, we look at children in rural and remote communities where there's, in the public sector, there's up to a 2-year wait list to see a child psychologist, let alone a child psychiatrist. We are then, you know, even in metropolitan cities, if you don't have your private healthcare that may give you an appointment in 6 months, you will find that you're waiting at least 12 months. And what happens is that you've got your child who is displaying these at-risk symptoms that are beginning to kind of like start off as being a problem, with a year's, up to 2 years wait until you see a psychologist, is a phenomenal time wasted. So what I've been suggesting is that, you know, we work with the teachers to almost unpack some of those early behavioural problems, to see if early interventions, if, you know, very early in when a child starts school, can actually mean that either the neurodiverse difficulties or behaviours go away, or at least you started some intervention early while you wait for your appointment. But it is a huge issue, isn't it? Because even a 12-month wait is too long. And unless we ease that bottleneck, children that are in critical need will not get seen either. So looking at, can early interventions for a portion of children really help dissipate those early developmental differences, I think is one way forward. There needs to be other solutions put forward. There needs to be almost like a national task force on this. What do we do with children, you know, as they wait on these incredible wait lists, and what can we do to really help them develop?
Thank you. And that's sort of the more medical approach to understanding disability. If we're thinking about some of the supports we know make a huge difference for neurodivergent individuals, they're great for all learners. Is there anything that you could talk to around some things, the practical things that teachers might be able to consider, or some other, and we've talked a little bit about it, but can you unpack that idea of neuroaffirming supports in a classroom?
Yeah, I think the more knowledge that teachers have about neurodevelopmental differences, you know, it's gone through many variations, is the word neurodiversity, but it's also a recognition by parents and teachers that children develop at different rates, right? And really understanding that your child may well develop to an equivalent age-related, whatever age-related activity that might be, it just will take time. In others, that will never happen, and resources need to be in. But I think one thing parents can stop doing maybe is contact Dr. Google, and instead focus on the community resources, of which there are so many great services out there for children who are struggling at school, and focus on what they can help, how they can bring in their support. And you know, they have so many parent support groups. I think it's when parents go onto a Google search, you know, they can see a case scenario where they're escalating their child years in advance of what may or may not happen. So I think looking to your community supports, looking at what other parents, you know, that have had similar kind of like trajectories of behaviours, or you can actually talk to them, work with them, use your community organisations as well as your teachers.
Thank you. We have a question from the online audience. What are your thoughts on responding to specific impacts from the pandemic? And some examples they've used are increased sleep challenges for autistic individuals, and other flow-on effects from particular...
Yeah, I think, you know, I mentioned it briefly in my book, and I have tried to get some media attention on this, because our children who really have, you know, neurodisabilities, who have autism, whose routine was so dependent on the people around them prior to the pandemic. So they were dependent on all of the health professionals that worked with them, on getting to school, getting back, following into the routines. Having that whole team of support was pretty much taken away for most of the pandemic. And no, as far as I can see, there's not been any spotlight on these kids now. Like, where are they? What are they doing? Because if we think our children that are going into regular classrooms struggled, we have children who, you know, would have had enormous impaired sleep, children who, you know, are so anxious and distressed. Some autistic children probably never wanting to go into a school again. You know, children who would have spent years focusing and working with a one adult, one teacher, never had that opportunity to do that and is really struggling. So, you know, I would love to see a spotlight on what these children need now, you know, because like I've said with many of the other groups of children that were disadvantaged, that were rural and so on, is that they have exponentially now got issues that are remaining uncovered, really. And they deserve, and their families deserve, to have a spotlight on what our nation can do now.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one more question from the room, if there is one. Yes, great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm in a school, in a pre-K to 12, and I'm interested in what you think about the lag effect of what we might still continue to see. So the 2 to 3 year olds who have now started school, and you know, as they move through the schooling system, what I notice is that the modelling that comes ahead of children is different. It looks different. So because the 9 and 10 year olds are not behaving and modelling for those younger children, and you know that my year 11s are not didn't see the modelling. You know, have you looked at what the lag might be like for those younger children?
That is an incredible question, and thank you so much for that, because they would have had siblings as well that were now maybe 6, 7 or 8. There needs to be intensive spotlight put on those children to see if there's any, almost like a residual impact that may impact them in those early school years. And this is where, you know, recognising that teachers can be so vigilant in those early years and knowing what to expect. But teachers only know what to expect if there's investment in the research and the technology and the interventions that will really make an impact. Thank you. That is a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our time is nearly up, I think, Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For talking today and for a brilliant book. It's done, I think, exactly what that series is intended to do, to provoke a debate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Colleagues, if you'd like to stay around, there'll be refreshments afterwards. If you like our public events, come along to the next one, or one of the next ones, which is about learning, design and technology. and it's based around those research themes, but also our new degree that starts next year in the Faculty Bachelor of Learning, Design and Technology. I think this recording will be available on YouTube very soon after this event is over. Thank you very much for coming.